Good afternoon, everyone. So, since yesterday we had some technical issues, so we'll be having a revision of yesterday's class. So, we are beginning with the cerebellum. So, the cerebellum we will be dealing under the following heading: Introduction, Gross Anatomy, Subdivisions, Anatomical, Morphological, Functional Subdivisions, the deep cerebellar nuclei, cytoarchitecture, input and output to the cerebellum, the functions, blood supply, and finally the applied anatomy. Change after. ಏನು ಬರ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ. So, we'll be doing the class on cerebellum. We'll be dealing under the following heading. So, coming to the introduction. So, cerebellum is part of the hind brain. As you can already see here, it's a part of the hind brain. You all know hind brain consists of the pons, the medulla oblongata and the cerebellum. And where is it situated? The cerebellum, it is situated in the posterior cranial fossa. As you can make out here, it is situated in the posterior cranial fossa. So, beneath this tent-like fold of dura mater, what you are seeing here, that is your tentorium cerebelli. So, underneath the tentorium cerebelli, separating it from the occipital lobes of the cerebrum, you have the situation of the cerebellum. So, in the dissection also, when you have removed your tentorium cerebelli, you have seen one surface of the cerebellum, that was your superior surface. So, you can see here there is a cavity present in relation to the cerebellum, that is your fourth ventricle, what you studied in the morning today. So, behind in front of that you can see the pons and also the medulla oblongata. Just like the cerebellum is also made up of two cerebellar hemispheres that are separated from another fold of dura mater, what is seen, that is called as the falx cerebelli. Now, this cerebellum is connected to various parts of the brain stem, that is your midbrain, the pons and the medulla oblongata through through channels which contains fibers, and those are called as the cerebellar peduncles. So, the cerebellum is connected to the midbrain, to the pons and to the medulla oblongata through different peduncles. So, you can see here, this is the cerebellum what you are able to see. So, here will lie your tentorium cerebelli, separating it from the cerebrum, and between the two cerebellar hemispheres you will have the falx cerebelli. This is the fourth ventricle, this is the midbrain, this is the pons and this is the medulla oblongata. So, these are the tracts which are present communicating different parts of the brainstem to the cerebellum. So, as the name suggests, superior cerebellar peduncle connects the cerebellum to the midbrain because that is the most superior part of the brainstem. In the middle we have the pons, hence middle cerebellar peduncle connects this part, connects the pons with the cerebellum, and below we have the medulla oblongata, and hence this is called as the inferior cerebellar peduncle, which are taking fibers to and from the cerebellum. Now we shall come to the gross anatomy of the cerebellum. So just like the cerebrum, the cerebellum also contains an outer grey matter and an inner white matter, and within the white matter it contains again masses of grey matter which represents the deep cerebellar nuclei. So what is this grey matter and white matter? So you can see here the shading difference. You can make out there are lot of depressions present here, just like how you see the depressions here in the cerebrum. But the difference you can make out here, the depressions here are very fine, and these depressions are called as the fissures, and they correspond to the sulci of your cerebrum. And the area of cerebellum which is present between two fissures is called as the folia. So you can see lot of folia with fissures present. So you can see the white matter in the center, which is then extending into each and every folia of the cerebellum. So when you see the entire outlook, it looks like a tree with its many branches. Hence this form or this pattern is given the name arbor vitae cerebelli. Okay, arbor vitae cerebelli. Now what is the purpose of the presence of these fissures and folia? Just like how you had seen the villi in the small intestine, which was increasing the surface area for absorption, here also these folia will contain just 15% on the surface of neurons, whereas the rest of the 85% is contained within these folds of the cerebellum. Here again you will see the masses of deep nuclei, and those are called as the deep cerebellar nuclei. You have four pairs: nucleus dentatus, nucleus globosus, nucleus emboliformis, and nucleus vestigiae. We will see the details of it later. Now coming to the subdivisions of the cerebellum. Now cerebellum can be divided into three forms of subdivision: anatomical, morphological and functional. To begin with, we will see what are the anatomical subdivisions. Now to begin with, because of the position of the cerebellum in the posterior cranial fossa, a fissure is formed between the two surfaces of the cerebellum. So this surface what you are seeing is called as the superior surface, and this which is in contact with the bone of the posterior cranial fossa, this is called as your inferior surface. So this fissure which is seen both laterally and posteriorly, that forms your horizontal fissure which separates the superior surface from the inferior surface. It is more of a mechanical fissure which is formed due to the pushing of the cerebellum into the posterior cranial fossa. Next, you can see these two structures here, okay. This one, so this is called as your flocculonodular lobe. So this middle portion, what you see here, worm-like structure, this is called as the vermis, and these two halves form the cerebellar hemispheres. So they are connected to each other by this midline portion which is called as the vermis. As it is evident here in the picture, the superior surface, the two cerebellar hemispheres are continuous with each other over the vermis, whereas on the inferior surface, a clear notch can be seen between the two cerebellar hemispheres, and this notch represents the vallecula. Now, two other fissures can be seen here. The first fissure is this one here, which is called as the posterolateral fissure. This separates the inferior surface of the cerebellum from a separate node here called as the flocculonodular lobe. The second fissure, what you can see here, is on the superior surface of the cerebellum. So this is the superior surface you are seeing here. On the superior surface, you can see this fissure which is called as the fissura prima. And this divides the superior surface into an anterior 2/3 and posterior 1/3. So the anterior 2/3 forms what is called as the anterior lobe of the cerebellum, and the rest of the superior surface forms the posterior lobe of the cerebellum. Okay, again the superior surface. So to speak, so what happens here is two fissures are formed basically. First is the posterolateral fissure, which divides the entire body of the cerebellum into corpus cerebelli and another part called as the flocculonodular lobe, what you can see here. So, this posterolateral fissure is dividing the cerebellum into two parts. This whole thing is called as corpus cerebelli and this is called as the flocculonodular lobe. The other fissure what you can see is the fissura prima, which divides only the superior surface into an anterior lobe and the rest of the superior surface along with the inferior surface forms what is called as the posterior lobe. So, anatomically cerebellum is divided into anterior lobe, posterior lobe and a flocculonodular lobe. Each of these lobes have different connections and have different functions and developmentally also they are different. So, what are they? Further, each lobe, both the median portion that is the vermis and the cerebellar hemisphere are divided into various lobules and they are given specific names. We will see what is that. First seeing the vermis from above downward, this is the lingula, central lobule, culmen, declive, folium, tuber, pyramid and uvula, and this is the nodule here. Now, corresponding counterparts of the vermis on the cerebellar hemispheres are as follows. Lingula does not have any lateral extension. Central lobule forms the ala, culmen forms the quadrangular lobule, declive forms the lobulus simplex, folium forms the superior semilunar lobule, it is in the shape of a half moon, tuber forms the inferior semilunar lobule, pyramid has the biventral lobule and uvula has the tonsil. This you have seen when you are studying the foramen magnum. The counterpart of nodule is your flocculus. The whole thing is called as the flocculonodular lobe. So, here is the summary of all the lobes of the cerebellum, the subdivisions and the corresponding subdivisions of the cerebellum. So, this forms the anatomical subdivisions of your cerebellum. Next, coming to the morphological subdivisions. Depending upon how they have evolved, you have the division of cerebellum into archicerebellum or the oldest form of cerebellum, paleocerebellum, the older form, and neocerebellum, that is the newest one to occur. Archicerebellum was seen in aquatic animals and it is basically concerned with maintenance of equilibrium in the body and balance, because of which it has connections to the vestibular nucleus. So, archicerebellum is also called as the vestibular cerebellum. Coming to the paleocerebellum, it has connections with the spinal cord and it is related to control of posture, especially in the limbs and the axial and trunk muscles. Hence, it is also called as the spinal cerebellum. Neocerebellum is the newest form and it is seen in mammals. It has receiving impulses from the cerebrum, from the pons and it is mainly concerned with skilled motor activity, which is mainly seen in mammals, and hence this is the neocerebellum and most newly developed and is also called as the cerebropontine cerebellum. So, you can see here. So, what are the anatomical subdivisions of the cerebellum which corresponds to the following are as follows. Archicerebellum is represented by a flocculonodular lobe and the lingula. It has deep connections with the nucleus vestigi and it is mainly connected to the vestibular nucleus and its main function is equilibrium. Coming to the paleocerebellum, it is represented by the entire lobe except for the lingula and it is having the deep connection with the nucleus globosus and emboliformis. Main connection is with the spinal cord and it connects with the main function is controlling the crude movements of the limbs. Neocerebellum is represented by the entire posterior lobe or also the middle lobe except for the pyramid and uvula, and its chief connection is with the nucleus dentatus, receiving impulses from the cortex and the pons, and its main function is smooth performance of highly skilled voluntary movements of precision. Now, coming to the functional subdivisions. Now, functionally, as I have already told you, the posterolateral fissure is dividing the cerebellum into corpus cerebelli and flocculonodular lobe. So, the flocculonodular lobe or the archicerebellum forms what is the vestibular system. The cerebellum as such, the body of cerebellum as such can be divided into three zones here. You can see the mid zone, also called as the Vermian zone, the paramedian zone or the intermediate zone, and the lateral zones or the hemispherical zones. Now the vermal zone is mainly connected with the nucleus vestigi and the vestibular nucleus and is concerned with maintenance of equilibrium. The paramedian zone is connected with the nucleus interpositus and is concerned with the maintenance of posture and tone. So both the median and the paramedian zone together are responsible for maintaining the balance, equilibrium, tone and movements of both the axial and the peripheral muscles and limbs. Whereas the cerebral zone or the hemispherical zone or lateral zones are concerned with the skilled movements and they connect with what is called as the dentate nucleus. So you can see a summary here. The median zone and paramedian zone, they go to the medial descending systems and lateral descending systems and they help in motor execution. That is the whatever activity you have formed, the final performance of the activity is decided by these two zones. Whereas the lateral zone here, it is going to the motor nucleus, premotor nucleus which is present in the cortex, and from here they are going to plan the motor activity. So some activity is planned. For example, if you are going to type something onto your computer, how should the typing be done, at what speed it should be done, all that is planned by your lateral zone, but the execution, the actual execution is brought about by your median zones of the cerebellum. So you should make a note here, both planning and execution in accordance with the cerebrum is made out by your cerebellum. So for all your motor activity to occur smoothly, cerebellum is very, very important. So these were all the subdivisions of the cerebellum. They are very, very important. You should know the anatomical subdivision, the morphological subdivision and the functional subdivision. Now all of these are going to be connected to the deep cerebellar nuclei which will form the output of the cerebellum. So the deep cerebellar nuclei from medial to lateral you can find are nucleus vestigi, nucleus globosus, nucleus emboliformis and nucleus dentatus. Globosus and emboliformis together form what is called as the nucleus interpositus. As we have already seen, nucleus vestigi represents or has connections with the archicerebellum or the vestibulocerebellum concerned with maintenance of equilibrium. Nucleus globosus or nucleus emboliformis is connected to the spinal cerebellum and helps in controlling of the axial and peripheral muscles. Nucleus dentatus is the one which is connected to the lateral cerebral hemisphere and has its function in controlling or regulating the skilled motor activity. So this is the diagram representing the deep cerebellar nuclei. It is usually a short answer question for you to name the deep cerebellar nuclei. So this crumpled U-shaped structure what you are seeing here is your dentate nucleus. This is the emboliform nucleus, globose nucleus together called as the nucleus interpositus, and this is the vestigial nucleus. Since the vestigial nucleus is close to the roof of the fourth ventricle, it is also called as the roof nucleus. So this is the gross picture you can see. This crumpled shape what you have seen marked in yellow is your dentate nucleus. This is your emboliform nucleus, globose nucleus representing the nucleus interpositus, and higher above what you are seeing here is the vestigial nucleus. So these form the deep cerebellar nuclei. Now coming to the cytoarchitecture of the cerebellum, this shall be just a recap since you have already done in detail in histology of the cerebellum. So as you all know, it is divided into the outer grey matter and inner white matter. The grey matter is further divided into three layers from outside. This is the molecular layer what you can see. Then a single layer of cells forming the Purkinje cell and a very cellular layer forming the granular cell layer. In the molecular layer, you know it is mainly arborization of all the cells which are present here, that is the Purkinje cells and the granular cells. In addition to that, you contain extra cells here which is called as the stellate cell and basket cell. In the Purkinje layer, you are getting a single flask shaped cell here which, whose dendrites will arborize in the molecular layer and axons will enter the granular layer. The Purkinje cell layer forms the final output of the cerebellum. Then in the granular layer, you can find two types of cells, granular cells and Golgi cells. Golgi cells are the largest type of cells you can see. Granular cells, the dendrites will synapse with the Golgi cells and also with the afferent fibers which are coming to the cerebellum, we will be seeing later, and their axons will go and arborize in the molecular layer and form what is called as the parallel fibers through which they will be synapsing with the Purkinje layer. So all the cells in the cerebellum, stellate cells, basket cells, Purkinje cells and Golgi cells are inhibitory in nature except for the granular cells which are excitatory. That is very important. But the final output coming from the cerebellum is inhibitory in nature, and hence cerebellum represents the largest collection of inhibitory neurons present in the central nervous system. So this is how the cells are present within the various layers of the cerebellum. In the molecular layer, you are seeing the stellate cell and the basket cell. The dendrites of the stellates and basket cells are present in the molecular layer.